I want to start off with a question, and that is, who's heard of life sucks and then you die? Okay? I think most of us have probably uttered that at some point. And if you've ever been where I've been, life does sometimes suck. But the paradox deserves a second part. It's an uncompleted paradox. Because often, when we're in our most challenging moments, when we're struggling for breath, we find purpose and passion. We show up. And so I would like to offer a second part to Life Sucks and Then You Die, and that is, there's value in paying a price. For everything else, there's MasterCard. I began my career as a ballet dancer in South Africa, and in my early 20s I was laid off injured. My parents approached me and they had this conversation with me. It went like this: Wendy, you did quite well academically at school, didn't you? I wasn't quite sure where this is leading. I said, well, I can't really remember that, but what are you suggesting? Well, now that you're off injured from ballet dancing, we thought that you might like to study to become an accountant. Yes. Ballet dancing to becoming an accountant. I can't think of a bigger divide. But I took them up on their offer, and I duly studied to become a chartered accountant. And I'm pleased to say, sorry, can you see that? Okay. I'm pleased to say that after studying as a chartered accountant, I began my corporate career. And I focused on corporate treasury, and I began climbing up the ladder of my career. And I'm pleased to say, ladies, I smashed through the glass ceiling with the heels. You know that ceiling that has all the lipstick stains on the top? I smashed through that, and I found myself as the only female executive at board level in a listed company in South Africa. And we have some South Africans here today, so this will be interesting to you. So there I was, a female amongst men, and the culture of this company was run by two individuals. They were the joint CEOs of the company. They were also the founding members of the company. And they ran this company in a very hubristic, maverick, shoot-from-the-hip kind of fashion. From an external point of view, our company, LeisureNet Limited, was considered to be strong on corporate governance. We ticked all the compliance boxes. We appeared from an external point of view to be a really robust company. So much so that institutional shareholders couldn't wait to fill their boots with the share. The reality from an internal point of view was quite different, however. These two individuals were mavericks. They were prepared to take the risks with completely denying any kind of peril that might happen from taking the risks. Over the 8 years of working in LeisureNet, I'd observed a number of small ethical lapses. And my observation also looked to my group, where nobody spoke out about it. Everybody looked the other way, minded their own business, pretended it didn't happen. And I wondered about that. And as the years progressed, I noticed that these small ethical lapses, they collapsed and catapulted into much larger ethical lapses. So in the year 2000, as the group treasurer, and now we were an international company, I was requested by the two joint CEOs to begin transferring hundreds of millions of rands out of this public listed company into an unknown company in Jersey. Now I've got to say, for me personally, I was in my 30s at that point. I considered, and Charlie, you mentioned it earlier, I had arrived. And I want you to remember that, because I'm going to swing back to it. And in terms of my framework of what arrival meant, it meant that I had a panoramic view from my office. I got to use the exclusive lift for only the executives that took us to the 5th floor. I had plush carpets, and I had a leather lounge suite. I had arrived. And I was now suddenly being requested to transfer hundreds of millions out of this company. Didn't make sense to me, into a bank account in Jersey. Now remember, we're in the year 2000 in South Africa. Internet's not great. We don't have all the kind of avenues that we have now that we can explore these things. But I began to explore, and I began to ask why. Now the interesting thing about asking why is it is an act. It's not a thinking process. It's an act of articulating a question. And what gave me permission to do that was because I was already an outlier in my group. I was the only female in that team. And I felt that it gave me greater permission to ask the difficult questions. So often when people don't speak out, they say, oh yeah, but I was only the female, or I was the only male, or I was too junior, or I was too senior. We rationalize why we shouldn't, find reasons to rationalize why we should. Anyway, back to the transfer of monies. I wasn't prepared to transfer the money. The joint CEOs who were in Australia at the time began to threaten me over the phone to say, well, you know, how long have you been in our company? Are you prepared just to disobey what we were asking you to do? Who's in charge? Have you not, read the hierarchy? And I chose not to do that. I chose to begin asking the questions of my financial director, of the group legal director, the HR director. And I was met, literally, with office doors being closed in my face, whispers and gossip in the corridors as I walked past, which only highlighted or amplified that there was a red flag for me to look at. Now, in the year 2000, South Africa, we had no whistleblowing laws, we had no protective acts, there were no processes to follow. So my best next step was to phone the South African Revenue Services anonymously. They requested for me to come in, which I declined to do. However, they were able to link the phone number with the company. And within a week, an inquiry was began. And these men in black suits arrived at the property, literally in black suits, and they formed a gang of KPMG forensic accountants, liquidators, and attorneys. And they came to the office and began to start inquiring what was going on. It became very, very quickly evident that I had rumbled them. I had two nicknames. One was Wendy the Wild Card, because they didn't quite know or trust what I would do with certain information. I was going to be a gadfly. And the second one was Poison Dwarf, which was a reference to Charlene Tilton, I think, in Dallas. Anyway, so also because I was the group treasurer, I was very intimately aligned with what was going on in the company. So I immediately lost my job. I lost my career, and I lost my livelihood. And you can see by some of these headlines why it was called the biggest corporate disaster in South African history. So there I was, no more career, no more livelihood. I had a 12-year-old son to look after. And what was worse, I began to get death threats. And they came anonymously and cowardly through telephone messages and emails. And my 12-year-old son was exposed to this vitriol as well. And in the context of South Africa, where a death threat can become a reality, I elected to take myself and my son and put us in self-imposed exile in the UK. Very quickly in the UK, because of my background, I was offered 2 jobs. The first was to be the group treasurer of Channel 4, and the second one was to be the group treasurer of the Virgin Group in Notting Hill Gate. And I felt, even though the Channel 4 job or the package was so much better in terms of money, I would go for the Virgin Group because of the reputation. So I began work there in March 2001, and everything seemed to go very, very well until 6 months into my job, after having received a glowing job appraisal, I was dismissed from my position in a very Kafkaesque fashion, marched off the premises like a criminal. And I was never given the background to why that happened. I had no statutory rights because I hadn't worked for the company longer than 6 months. So even though this Kafkaesque firing appeared to be unjust and unfair, I had no legal right to appeal it, even though I had had a very good relationship with Richard Branson and had written a number of letters to him after my firing. I never got a response. So there I was, in a foreign country, having been fired from my job in South Africa for doing the right thing, fleeing my homeland because of death threats into a foreign country, where I was now fired in a Kafkaesque fashion, with the explanation being told that I thought my job was more important than they thought it was. And we're talking about a group treasury role. It just didn't make sense for me. Unable to secure any kind of job after that, I began to slip into a deep, gripping, dark depression. My world fell silent, and I sealed myself off from any cracks or fissures that could come into my life from this foreign world that didn't make sense to me. I was unable to secure more employment for 2 reasons. The inquiry now had started in South Africa, and I had been labelled the whistleblower. And secondly, I had been fired by the British Guard of Entrepreneur. So my CV had no value in the marketplace. And it was when I woke up one day, literally, in this fog of depression, that I realized I had no food in the fridge to feed my son. I had no money to pay the rent. And because I had been so diminished and I'd become so contracted, this cardboard cutout, one-dimensional Wendy was able to take myself off and beg on the streets in Kingston on Thames. It was almost like, if my final consideration is to commit suicide, if that's what I can consider, I can take one step back and beg on the streets, because then at least I'm still here. So that's literally what I did. And here's where the story gets interesting. I realized that when you have a breakdown, when you fragment, and when life sucks, you don't simply dissolve or die or disappear. All my hard skills were still intact. I was still a chartered accountant, so I began to use those skills to help me on the streets. I had a rock-solid budget and cash flow, which I was able to share with my fellow beggars. The beggars around me became my new tribe, so I was never alone. Secondly, I was able to utilize my negotiating skills, Because a beggar's life is very much like everyday life. You can't just pull into a position and position yourself there. You have to negotiate your place. So I was able to utilize my Excel spreadsheets and my articulation to help the beggars around me so I could secure a good begging spot. And some of you may have passed me. I was at Kingston upon Thames railway station. As you came out, and there's a great mosaic at the background, that is where I positioned myself. I also observed that British people love their dogs. So I used my marketing skills by taking my 2 dogs along with me, and my revenue streams increased. I knew my life was upside down, but I began to question what the right side up was anyway, and according to whom. So I elected to surrender to being upside down for as long as it took. And I'm not negating or diluting the pain of this experience, but I worked with it rather than pushed against it. Whilst I was on the streets, I learned a number of valuable lessons. In the past and up to that point, my measure of success was the acquisition and the consumption of more. I had enough in my life in terms of money and acquisition to escape my reality. If I'd had a bad day at work, I'd simply take myself off for a nice meal, or buy myself a nice pair of shoes, or even better, book myself a holiday, escape my reality completely. But in this situation, when I had nothing, and I'm going to re-emphasize nothing, because a lot of people think they have nothing when they have a lot. And this was evidenced recently to me when I was in Paul at the Initiatives of Change event, and I shared my story with people. And when I said that I had nothing, I meant that I had nothing. I didn't have a trust fund I could draw on. I didn't have a house that I could sell and liquidate and put cash into my bank account. My parents were in South Africa. They weren't fleeing to help me. There was nothing. When I say nothing, I mean nothing. And when I was at the Initiatives of Change event recently, and we were talking about what nothing is, people would say to me, I know what that feels like. I've also had nothing. And then 5 minutes into the conversation would say, my house in Wimbledon, I'm just redoing it, or building a new garage, or my house in Devon, or the holiday in Morocco. And I'd say, hang on a minute, did you just say you have a house in Wimbledon? Yes, oh, but it's just small. And it's important, and I said this with love and care and gratitude, for people to be reminded of what they have. Because you can't share what you have unless you know what you have. And that's really, really important. So I had nothing. I was forced. There was nothing external for me out in the world anymore. I was forced to go within. And I found the most amazing thing. I found my own integrity. And if I look at the word integrity meaning wholeness and completeness, and in, holding power. So intimacy, introspection, in group, in crowd, it holds power. And I found my own integrity in that space. I found that to place myself at the gates of hope every day, instead of the gates of self-righteousness as a whistleblower, those gates only shrill and creak on ugly hinges. I knew my voice would not be heard there, so I placed myself at the gates of hope every single day. I learned a very dismaying thing about this paradigm of society that we've constructed and we are part of. That as I stood on the streets, I still felt that I had value as a human being. But because I had been excluded from the playground of life because I had no money, I had no currency to participate in the playground of life. I was deemed valueless. So because I was a beggar, and I was still a chartered accountant, I was still a principal person with a child to look after, making all those decisions around that. But because I was in that context with no money, I was deemed valueless. And that sucks. So I had to really, really convince myself I still had value. And one of the things that I did, I became acutely aware of the nature around us. That nature is us, by the way, and nature utilizes every situation created by every opportunity to be its best self. And I elected to follow suit. That no matter what the external projections were of me, I stood firm in terms of who I am and what I've done. I think as human beings we have a tendency, and this is where I want to loop back to I have arrived in my 30s, we all have a tendency to believe that we are defined by a point in time in our lives. It's not true. We are ever evolving. We're not a static species. And I personally began to trust that the dots from my historic life would join together to create a future life for myself. So how did I move beyond this? In terms of the trial, it took 11 years. 11 years to secure justice. They were sentenced in 2007, and they then bribed a judge to stay out of jail. So in 2007, I thought my job was done, and I was in South Africa at the time, and a woman approached me in the streets, because this was a high-profile case, and said, "Aren't you the whistleblower for the LeisureNet case?" To which I agreed, and she said, "Well, I just want to tell you," she said, in typical brutal South African fashion, "you've wasted all your time." She said, "I'm an estate agent, and I've just sold them the Elfin Hotel. So everything that you've done, you've sacrificed for nothing." Now, at that point, I could have walked away and said, "Well, I've done this for 7 years. I'm not prepared to revisit this." But I wanted to be the moral exemplar, because I think, again, it's the actions and the behaviors of others that are contagious, rather than what we speak about. It's the actions that are contagious. And to provide hope, literally for a South African context as well, that I wouldn't be that person that would just mind my own business, pretend that it was nothing to do with me, because we're often taught to mind our own business and look the other way. I was prepared to say that humanity is my business, and I'm going to step into the ring again. And I blew the whistle a second time on the South African Judicial Services, which is probably the most dangerous place one could be. But I won. And in 2011, I got the phone call from the state advocate saying they've just been picked up with their towel and soap, and they were going on to Polsman prison. So I then, at that point, was freed and liberated, I think for two reasons. Because I had secured justice. A lot of whistleblowers don't secure justice. I was freed and liberated to join those dots to continue in my future. And out of that, and on the back, literally, of merely my wit and welfare, and I'm going to repeat that again, on the back of wit and welfare, nothing more, no trust account, no mummy and daddy helping me build my business, nothing. I had to go out there and rebuild my profile and create my company called Speak Out, Speak Up. And the purpose of this company is to advocate not for whistleblowing. I don't want people to have to go down the route that I've gone through. I want to advocate for something called courageous conversations. Having those difficult conversations, whether it's in the context of your family life, your partner, your children, and your organizational life, they're difficult because it goes against our innate behavior, where we all want to belong, part of a social group. It's the cohesiveness that we think keeps ourselves safe. But by doing so, we often miss the opportunity to speak out and change the status quo. So Courageous Conversations is actually a social psych module that comes out of Stanford University called Social Fitness. And what I do now is I speak to organizational groups to be the moral exemplar, to hope that there's a contagion, that you can see yourselves in me as a normal, average person being able to speak truth to power, and how to do that. And that comes out of Courageous Conversations training. I just want to finish off with a little video. You may or may not have seen this, but I often get introduced as the lone nut. I take it as a compliment, because it's often the lone nut that actually initiates the change. But the lone nut has to be courageous enough, often to be vilified, ostracized, and kicked to the margins of society. I've been there and done that and got the t-shirt. And my call to action to you guys today is not to leave me as a lone nut, to join me in instilling courageous conversations for all of us.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not two nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that at TED. Thanks.
So who's going to join me? I'm the lone nut. I join you. Fantastic. I'll embrace you as an equal. Let's catch that Asia. Got any questions? Fire away.
Can you say more about courageous conversations? Are there different types of courageous conversation? Because your story starts with a courageous conversation about a very clear ethical misdemeanor. And I just wondered if you broadened the idea, the concept of courageous conversations to talk about other courageous conversations.
Certainly. Courageous conversations, if we have partners or children or anybody that we relate to in our lives, it takes courage to show up, be authentic, and tell the truth, your truth. You know, even to your partner or relative to say, I don't like what you're doing, I find it offensive. But also as a recipient of the courageous conversation, because it's a two-way street. So it's not just about one person delivering bad news, it's also the recipient being able to listen and act on that negative information. And that's a very, very difficult thing, because we always assume, especially in an organizational context, that the leader has so much self-worth that, well, they're in a leadership role, so why should they have a problem with me telling them about issues within the company? But when people receive bad news, it reflects on their own self-concept and their own self-efficacy, whether that's organizational or whether that's in a personal dynamic. So as much as we work with a module for an individual to be delivering that courageous conversation, it's also about the recipient being able to listen, hear, and act on that information. And a lot of people say, is it courageous? Yes, I think it has to be aspirational, because it's not a norm yet. If it was a social norm that we were able to have these difficult dialogues, we would call it commonplace conversations. But we're not there yet, so it needs to be aspirational, and that word courage is the aspirational bit. And when we are asked to stretch ourselves and step out of our comfort zones, that takes courage. Hence the word courage in the conversations. And it's a very interesting module. It comes from, I don't know if any of you have heard of Dr. Phil Zimbardo of the Stanford Prison Experiments. He created the social fitness, social psych course. So it comes out of his work from the Stanford Prison Experiments, which is a very interesting study in itself.
Okay. I'll go next. Okay.
One people.